and our Redeemer. Please be seated. In my first year of seminary, we had to put Jesus on trial, where we were each assigned various roles based on people who would have been active at the time of Jesus. Some Romans, some Pharisees, Sadducees, some Essenes for the Dead Sea Scrolls, some members of the Sanhedrin, some ordinary Galileans. Each one of us was expected to come dressed as authentically as possible and present a testimony that would be in character for that individual. To put it mildly, the atmosphere in that room was very tense as we all presented our differing points of view. And then we had to vote. Should Jesus be condemned to death? Our group voted a majority no. He should not be put to death. We started to clap and cheer. I was so happy and so relieved just to think that because of our compassionate and merciful class, we were so much nicer than people were 2,000 years earlier, and we would not wish Jesus to go through that terrible suffering. But then our professor said, "Think hard, everyone. Would it truly have been a good thing if Jesus did not go to the cross?" And that's a very pertinent question for us all today, given today's gospel passage. It's very easy to identify with Peter, who loved Jesus, did not wish him to suffer, and was ready to rebuke him and to discourage him from any such thoughts of allowing himself to suffer. And what was Jesus' response? Rather similar, in fact, to my professor. Jesus was not in favor of Peter's point of view at that moment. In fact, Jesus' response was a bit shocking, all the more shocking when we think about last week's gospel, beautifully illuminated by Reverend Maria, in which Jesus praised Peter. "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." And he goes on to say that because he recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, and therefore unto him would be given the leadership of the church. So it was all very wonderful. And today's passage follows immediately after that. Was it not just simply commendable that Peter, out of love for Jesus, didn't want him to suffer? So why did Jesus say, "Get behind me, Satan"? Well, let's think. Was Jesus calling Peter Satan, or was something else going on here? Is it possible that the innocent, blumbering Peter was actually allowing himself to be tempted to give voice to the rather dark forces that Jesus knew all too well? Think back to Jesus' time in the desert, how well he got to know that voice that was always seeming to offer something good, bread, when Jesus was hungry, worldly glory. How wonderful did that sound? And now, through Peter's blumbering words, came a greater temptation. Why should Jesus have to go through such terrible things? Well, the very fact that it was Satan not wanting Jesus to go to the cross really makes us wonder then, why would he have wanted to block this? And knowing the wiles of Satan, most likely we can suspect because it had to do with something that was going to be good for all of mankind, as Jesus knew so well. But why do we need Jesus to go to the cross? Let's start with where we are right now and how we got here. As was raised very movingly in today's forum, expertly led by Jonathan, We discussed the problems of the world and how we might have got here, despite God's sovereignty and love. We do have a loving and a gracious God. He created a planet like a paradise for us to live in, and He gave us agency and free will and abundance to live in this wonderful world. On the other hand, we wanted to be masters of our own destiny, captains of our own ship, heroes of our own stories. Is there anything wrong with that? Really? I can identify with that desire all too well. So was there anything wrong with wanting to be the captain of your own ship? Well, when we start to think soberly about the state of the world that we're in right now, I would have to say, if we're being honest, then yes, I think we all know that fundamentally there really is something wrong with all of us wanting to be in control. It hasn't really gone that well. Let's just think of what the world is telling us. The world tells us we have to be significant, but where does that get us? Look at all the insecurity that can fuel. The world tells us that we must be successful, that we must be prosperous, that we must be comfortable, that we must be storing away for retirement, and so on and so on. We must build security in the things of this world. And where does that all get us? A lot of hoarding of resources by a few, and a lot of poverty of a great number. I can speak for myself. I can say that I'm extremely uncomfortable whenever I think about climate change, and yet I've done virtually nothing to change my own lifestyle. I get very uncomfortable when I think about homeless people and how cold they are in the winter, and I open my closet and it's still full of coats. I don't know if any of you can identify with any of this, but if there's one person squirming right now, it's certainly me when I think about all of this. But there's good news for all of us. When we get concerned about the state of the world and when we get concerned about the state of our own heart, there is good news, and that is the fundamentals of our Christian faith, which we're shortly going to recite together in the Nicene Creed. In essence, the fundamentals of our faith are that God's way of rescuing us all from sin and the consequences of sin were through the life, the death, and the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. After all the suffering that He endured upon that cross, He earned the right to say, "It is finished." And because He endured that and because He died, He was able to be raised from the dead and ascended and was on the right hand of the Father in glory. And because of all of that, we have been set free to live lives not of darkness and selfishness, but of abundance and peace and joy and great openness. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I learned all of that in Sunday school, but I don't really think that it's that relevant to my life and the issues that I'm going through right now. And I can understand that. And there may be some of you that are visiting church for the very first time today, and some of this may sound all a bit mysterious. The good news is you've got some great priests here. You've got a great educational program. Please reach out. There's just so much richness to all of this, and I would just encourage you to take advantage of it. But how real is it all to the everyday life? Are any of us really that bad that Jesus would have to die for us? Really? Didn't He come to die for the murderers and the really bad people after all? Surely most of us are really quite nice. So I'd like to share something, a very short story with you. From the time that I was 13, I was wearing a very constrictive back brace for scoliosis. It was painful. The only way I could really get relief was to lie down, which I did often. Unusual for a 13-year-old, which brought about something else that was unusual, and that was quite a bit of contemplation, much more so than I otherwise likely would have done. And in that contemplation, I started thinking, and it started coming to me, I really was not the lovely little person that I thought that I was. In fact, I'd done quite a few things I regretted, and I was quite nasty to my parents, sorry to say. But try as I might, I just couldn't get better by own volition. Well, it was in the middle of all this, as I felt quite burdened by all of this, that at my school, which was an Anglican school, we saw a movie that contained some very graphic depictions of the crucifixion. And I sat there watching in horror. Suddenly, the thought struck me, what if I had been the only person in all of history who had ever messed up? And then the realization came just as quickly. Jesus would have gone through every bit of the same agony, even if it had been just for me. And so suddenly, this became pretty personal. This wasn't just a historical event 2,000 years ago. And this wasn't just something to think about on Sunday mornings. I wanted to think, now what? How can I live my life for Him who has given so much to me? And so ultimately that propelled me to medical school, ultimately to the priesthood. But I would have to say it has never been an easy journey. And that brings me to the second part of today's gospel. What about Jesus' call to us that we are to take up our crosses and follow Him? Again, if we're honest with ourselves, that doesn't particularly sound like a very appealing invitation, does it? However, I know that this concept means a lot to this church, because as I turn right now and I look up at your beautiful new window commemorating two incredible contemporary Anglican saints, and I hope you've all seen this window. If not, please do so. And I'm sure you've all heard, because there have been great explorations of this, the sermon by Bishop Victoria Matthews, the 90th birthday for Desmond Tutu, etc. You probably all know a lot about both of these people. But what I'd like to point out today is that both of them didn't go out looking for their personal crosses. But when the time came, they embraced those challenges and lifted them up and followed Christ. And let's just think for a second about what happened because they did so. In the case of Florence Lee Timoy, we can think about the fact that as a young woman in China, she wanted to follow the call of Christ, and without any big ambitions, she went to seminary for 4 years. Then, during wartime, in Macau, where no priest could come to administer the sacraments, she prayerfully obeyed the call of her bishop to become ordained first as a deacon and then as a priest, so that she could administer the sacraments, which would have otherwise been impossible. Not only that, but had a beautiful priestly ministry, encouraged so many young people to be baptized, went around when food was very scarce, always managed to find food for the hungry and food for the hungry souls. So it was a beautiful and anointed ministry that she faithfully pursued until after the war, when that was taken away from her, and sadly suffered for many years under the Chinese government, before eventually being able to come to Canada, being able to be honored yet again as a priest. And since her death in 1992, her legacy only continues to grow around the world as thousands of women are able to follow in her footsteps and obey their calling, including hundreds of women in very poor countries who are able to become priests and can serve as priests where there are otherwise no priests. Amazing legacy. Also amazing, is, of course, is the legacy of Bishop Desmond Tutu and all that he did with his courage and his grace, standing up under apartheid. He could have had many reasons to be fearful and to be silent, but he didn't. He spoke out for truth and for justice. And then after the time of apartheid, he worked, as you know, tirelessly for forgiveness and for reconciliation. So as we think about those two modern saints, and we think about our own lives, let us consider that there really should be a sense of urgency in the choices that we need to make every day in our own lives. Quoting Desmond Tutu, God says to you, I have a dream. Please help me to realize it. It is a dream of a world whose ugliness and squalor and poverty, its war and hostility, its greed and harsh competitiveness, its alienation and disharmony are changed into their glorious counterparts when there will be more laughter, joy, and peace, where there will be justice and goodness and compassion and love and caring and sharing. And so, my brothers and sisters, the paradox of the cross is that when each of us is willing to take that more challenging path, to pick up our own particular cross and follow Jesus in the way that each one of us is called to follow. Perhaps that means by forgiving people that are challenging to us. Perhaps it means being far more generous with our time and our talent. Be that as it may, whatever it is, by following in our own path that Jesus models for us, we can enable God's dream to be realized here in our world. And as we gather together today for the Eucharist, consider that it is by receiving Christ's incredible sacrifice that we become one with him and one with each other, and become transformed into agents of healing and wholeness for this world, for which we say thanks be to God. Amen.